If you have ever closed the door and felt the room change, you know this. Being alone is more than no people. You know how fast the quiet can feel calm, and how fast it can press back when the last voice leaves. Here is the difference we have to understand. Solitude removes company, then changes what the mind notices and what memory brings forward. Here is why this question matters. It is not about lonely people being fixed. It is about what happens to thought when the social mirror disappears and the room gets louder. Pascal saw the empty room as exposure. Montaigne saw that retreat does not guarantee clarity. Nietzsche saw that distance can free thought and warp it. Arendt separated solitude from loneliness and isolation, so we would stop using one word for every kind of aloneness. By the end of tonight, we will know why the empty room changes the mind instead of simply removing company. Let's begin. Now, if you've ever shut the door after the last person left and felt the air change, this is the first thing to notice. The quiet is not empty. It starts handing your own attention back to you, and that can feel like relief for a moment before it feels like exposure. That is where this begins, and not with loneliness, and not with a rule about how much solitude is healthy. The pressure here is philosophical from the beginning. It begins with a simple fact most of us recognize once someone says it out loud. When the noise drops away, thought does not simply settle, but it reorganizes itself. You sit down after everyone has left, and the first thing you notice is not peace. It is detail, and the fridge, and the pipe in the wall, and your own breathing, the feel of your shirt against your shoulder. Then attention folds back one layer further, and now you are noticing that you are noticing, and the room has not become hostile. It has become legible, and that can feel unsettling because the mind is suddenly no longer hidden inside social motion. Here is the part we usually miss. When other people are in the room, even if nobody says much, the self stays partly outside itself. It tracks tone, posture, timing, expectation, and the possibility of response. So that social mirror helps us relate to others and also distributes the self across the room. We are not fully inside our own head because some of our attention is always out there adjusting to the presence of somebody else. Then the room empties and the distributed self has to come back together, and that return can feel peaceful, or it can feel like pressure, and often it feels like both. And 1 minute you think, good, finally no more performance. The next minute you realize that no performance means no buffer, and no buffer means memory has more room. So does regret. So does the sentence you wish you had never said. So does the thought you have been postponing because it was easier to keep moving. You have finished dinner, and the dishes are done, and the house is quiet, and the phone is on the counter. Nothing is asking anything of you, and for a few seconds the body relaxes, and then the mind discovers that there is nowhere left to hide. Look what happens next, and maybe you reach for the phone, and maybe you stand up and find a task. Maybe you check the window, the sink, the shelf, the clock, anything. The point is not that you are weak. The point is that the room has removed the social pressure that used to keep the self slightly outward facing. So when the room gets louder, that is not only a metaphor, and it is a change in the geometry of attention. Imagine boredom is too small a word for what is often happening, and boredom suggests a lack of stimulation. But what is really happening is exposure. The mind is no longer being held in place by interruption, and so it starts circling its own contents. That is why a quiet night can feel calm for a minute, and then suddenly feel loaded. The silence did not invent the material, and it gave the material enough space to move. Think we do not usually notice how much company manages us, and we think solitude means less happening. In one sense it does, and in another sense it means more happening inside, and the mind starts reviewing, replaying, anticipating. It becomes aware of its own texture. Once that happens, you can no longer pretend that the room is just a background. That is why the experience matters philosophically. Solitude is not only an absence, it is a test of what the mind does when nobody answers, and what the self sounds like when no one interrupts. It asks whether our thoughts are our own, or whether they were being held together by the social world around us. A little silence can be soothing, but the deeper thing happening is that thought is turning back toward itself. Attention is no longer split between the world and the room. The room now has it. That is when you discover how much of your ordinary life depends on being seen, heard, or simply accompanied. Not because you are fake, and because humans are relational creatures and attention is not a sealed container. The first thing that changes is not the room. It is the size of the inner echo. When other people are gone, small sounds suddenly carry more weight, and we hear not only the room but our own habit of filling it. That is why a quiet night can feel kind for a minute and then feel strangely exposed. The stillness does not invent a problem, and it gives the problem a microphone. And there is a deeper thing here. We often imagine solitude as if it were a blank state, but it is never blank. It is full of the last conversation, the unfinished task, the thing we did not answer, the role we were performing before the door closed. We do not simply step into silence, and we carry the day into it, and that is why the mind starts moving so quickly. It is trying to settle the room it has brought with it, and we also have to think about the body. Shoulders drop, and breathing changes. The hands look for something to do. Solitude is a physical condition as much as a thought condition, and that is one reason it can surprise us so quickly. We think we have entered a simple kind of quiet, and then the nervous system starts reporting on all the unfinished business we carried in with us. And this is why the room can feel larger at night than it did at noon. Not because the walls changed, because the body is no longer being steered by the rhythm of other people. The absence of that rhythm is a kind of silence, but it is also a loss of structure. Once you notice that, the room stops being a neutral container. It becomes a test of how much of your own attention can stand on its own. The room also changes scale, and at night, one lamp can feel like a whole weather system. One chair can feel like a witness. That is not imagination in the flimsy sense. It is attention rediscovering how much of its world was built out of other people's movement. That matters because it explains why aloneness can feel so immediate, and the change is not abstract. It is spatial, bodily, and intimate. We think we are alone, then we feel the shape of the absence around us. The room also teaches us something about scale. The same space that felt ordinary with other people in it can suddenly feel enormous when the last voice leaves. That is because solitude changes the sound of thought as well as the content of thought. The mind starts hearing itself as if it were in a hall instead of a room. But that is why even tiny noises feel larger when we are alone, and the mind is no longer buffered by the room's other lives. It starts reporting on itself in real time, and that report can feel like calm for a moment before it turns into pressure. The change is small, but it changes everything because the room is no longer buffered by other people. The echo gets louder because the world has gone still, leaving the room to speak back to us. Quiet is never empty, which is why the silence has to be read rather than guessed. The question is not whether silence is pleasant, the question is whether silence reveals the structure of thought. And once you ask that, you can stop pretending that all being alone is the same thing. It does not simply remove sound, it changes the scale at which thought becomes audible. Once you notice that shift, the room is no longer neutral. It becomes a place where attention can be seen, tested, and returned to the world with a little more honesty. Now we can keep the room close enough to feel its pressure. You are not being asked to admire silence. You are being asked to notice how the mind changes when the last witness leaves and attention has nowhere easy to go. Now, if you've ever wanted an hour alone and also known the ache of being left out, you already know these are not the same condition. One asks for space, one asks for connection, and one changes the meaning of every room around it. Solitude is being with yourself, and loneliness is the ache of missing connection, and isolation is being cut off from the common world. They can overlap, but they are not interchangeable, and if we lose that distinction, we lose the whole argument before it even starts. You can be alone and not lonely, and you can be surrounded by people and still feel lonely. But you can be isolated without wanting it, and that changes everything. A weekend chosen on purpose is not the same as being left behind. A room entered freely is not the same room when the door was shut for you. Power changes meaning. That sounds obvious, but we keep flattening it because flattening is easier, And if every version of being alone is one wound, then the answer can be one kind of comfort. If every version is one virtue, then the answer can be one kind of praise. But life does not fit that neatly. Sometimes the same silence is restful, and sometimes it is a sign that something important has been taken away. Think about how quickly people turn aloneness into mood language, and they say they were alone and they mean sad, or calm, and stuck, or free. But those are not the same thing. A person in a cabin on purpose is not in the same condition as a person who has been quietly excluded from everything that used to hold their life together. The experience may look similar from outside. Inside it is not similar at all. That is why the first question is always, what kind of alone are we talking about? You sit with a book open and no one to impress, then notice whether attention becomes steadier or more theatrical. That is evidence too, because solitude shows whether the mind is reading, performing, or quietly escaping through its own commentary. Because if we do not ask, that we end up giving the wrong answer to the wrong problem. We tell someone who is grieving that solitude is good for them, and we tell someone who has been abandoned that being alone is a spiritual opportunity. Look, we tell someone who is overloaded that they should learn to sit still, and sometimes those statements are true. Sometimes they are insulting, and the difference lives in the detail. And imagine two identical rooms. Same chair, same lamp, same window, same weather outside. In the first room you chose to be there because you wanted an hour without anyone asking for anything. In the second room, the room is where you have ended up after the social world thinned out around you, after work changed, after friends drifted, after calls went unanswered for longer and longer, until nobody called as much anymore. Imagine from a camera's point of view, the rooms look identical, and from the inside one room gives you breathing space. The other room starts to feel like proof, and that difference is where the argument begins. We do this because language is lazy, and the mind likes shortcuts, and the shortcut lets us stop at the fact of no company. But the fact is not the argument. The argument begins when we ask whether the mind opened, tightened, or turned inward in a new way. Think, did the room help thought gather itself, and did it let fear get louder, and did it give memory more freedom? Did it expose an old pattern that company had been hiding? And that is what we need to know. Let's be stricter, and solitude is not loneliness, and solitude can be a practice, and loneliness can be a wound. Isolation can be a social condition, and one word cannot do all three jobs. Once we see that the topic gets more interesting, not less, because now we can ask what solitude gives to the person who chooses it, and what loneliness does to the person who did not. Now we can ask why some people speak about quiet with gratitude, while others hear the same word as abandonment. Now we can stop pretending that the room means the same thing in every life. The difference matters because language flattens it too easily. If we use one word for every kind of being alone, we end up mixing relief with injury and choice with loss. A person who closes the door to think is not in the same situation as a person who watches the calls stop. The outside scene can look the same, and the inside scene is not the same at all. That is why solitude is worth protecting from the word loneliness, and solitude can be a shelter for thought. Loneliness can be a wound that asks for relation. Isolation can be the breaking of the shared world itself. If we blur those together, we start handing out the wrong kind of answer to the wrong kind of silence. The room may be quiet in all three cases. What the quiet means is different every time. We can make the distinction even cleaner by asking what each state asks of us. Solitude asks for attention, and loneliness asks for relation, and isolation asks for repair. Those are not interchangeable demands. If we answer loneliness with more private reflection, we can miss the person who needs contact. If we answer solitude with constant company, we can steal from the mind the room it needed to become readable. So the mistake is practical, not only semantic. When we say every quiet hour is lonely, we treat choice like injury. When we say every injury can be redescribed as a practice, we treat pain like style. Arendt's distinction, and the ordinary experience behind it, keeps us from making either mistake. The meaning of being alone, lives in the cause as much as in the feeling. If we keep the distinction sharp, we also keep ourselves from moral confusion, and a person in solitude may need more time. A person in loneliness may need more contact, and a person in isolation may need the world rebuilt around them. The same sentence cannot serve all three. But that is the practical burden of the distinction, not to define words for their own sake, but to prevent the wrong remedy. When the room goes quiet, the first question is not what the quiet sounds like, it is what made it sound that way. The words matter because the wrong word changes the response. If we call a chosen hour of quiet loneliness, we shame what should have been protected. If we call abandonment a practice, we hide what should have been repaired, and the distinction is not academic. It is the difference between reading the situation and flattening it. And the point is not to make aloneness sentimental or tragic, it is to keep it legible. Once we know what kind of silence we are inside, we can answer it properly instead of confusing one condition for another. And the distinction is small on the page and huge in life, because the wrong word changes the response. Naming it well is part of living it well, and the name changes the feeling, which changes how we answer the room. That distinction is the bridge to Pascal, because Pascal is not interested in a warm, decorative version of being alone. He is interested in why the empty room can feel like exposure. But that is the practical point of the distinction. If we name the silence correctly, we can answer it correctly. Some quiet needs protection, some needs company, some needs repair. Mixing them up only makes the wrong kind of answer feel tidy but this distinction has to stay practical. If you name the room badly, you answer it badly. We protect solitude, answer loneliness, and repair isolation, because each one asks something different from a human life. Now, if you've ever reached for your phone the second a room went still, you have met the kind of restlessness Pascal was talking about. The silence is not making trouble out of nowhere, and it is exposing the speed with which the mind tries to flee itself. Most people treat distraction as a minor habit, and Pascal treats it as a clue. We do more than get bored, we flee. But we reach for noise because silence starts to expose what we would rather not face. The empty room is dangerous not because it contains something dramatic, but because it removes the covers. It takes away all the little things we use to keep from meeting ourselves too directly. You know the scene, messages are answered, work is done, dinner is over, and the house goes quiet. And for one moment there is relief, and then the mind starts looking for an exit. And a quick check, and a small errand, and a drink of water, and a pointless task. A random thought that is easier than the one in front of you, and it happens so quickly that we often miss the pattern. But Pascal would not miss it, and he would call it the human condition showing itself under pressure. He is not saying all distraction is evil, and he is saying the speed of our escape matters. Why do we reach for diversion so quickly, and why does the blankness of a room feel so loaded? So why does an hour without interruption produce not only quiet but unease? Because the self is not as self-contained as it would like to believe. Pascal is not telling us that every form of aloneness is bad because it is empty. He is saying the emptiness reveals how much of our ordinary life is built to keep us from being pinned down by ourselves. If the room feels unbearable, maybe the room is not the problem, and maybe the problem is what the room no longer covers up. Here is that sounds severe, but there is a kind of mercy in it too. And Pascal is not mocking us, he is describing us. We are not strange for wanting relief. We are not stupid for checking the phone in the first 10 seconds of quiet. We are human, and humanity includes a deep resistance to being left alone with the unfinished material of our own minds. Look, let's make the thought experiment even sharper. Picture someone who has spent the entire day moving from one form of noise to another. Messages, meetings, podcasts, music, errands, chatter, movement. Then the day ends, and the room is quiet, and nothing is wrong, and nothing dramatic has happened, yet the person feels strangely cornered. And why? Because the mind has been trained to live outward, and now outward has disappeared. Imagine silence becomes a confrontation with the fact that diversion was doing more work than we admitted. Pascal is useful here because he takes aloneness out of the wellness register and puts it under pressure. He is asking why we so often need distraction to survive ourselves. Not because life is meaningless, because the mind is easier to live with when it is distributed across enough noise to stop it from turning too directly inward. Think the empty room does not create the restlessness, and it reveals the restlessness that was already there. That is why the silence can feel so loud, and it is not producing a new problem. It is removing the insulation, and that changes the meaning of being alone, and it is no longer a neutral state. It becomes diagnostic. It tells you something about what your mind does when nobody else is in the room. It tells you whether you can remain present to your own thought, or whether you have organized your whole life around running away from that moment. Now that may sound harsh if we make it too simple. Pascal is not saying every person should become a monk. He is showing why the human being reaches for escape so fast, and why silence can feel threatening when there is no distraction left to soften it. The empty room is not a punishment, and it is a mirror that refuses to flatter. Pascal is not against pleasure. He is against the way pleasure can keep us from seeing what we are doing, games, noise and errands, along with status games and arguments. They all have one thing in common. They keep the mind occupied just enough that it does not have to stand still and notice itself. The empty room removes that protection, and that is why it feels severe, and it is not attacking us. It is uncovering us. And Pascal's point goes further than boredom. He is saying that human beings are not comfortable with finitude when finitude is left alone. We do not like to meet our own limits without a mask in place. The quiet room makes that limit visible. It shows how quickly we reach for diversion, not because diversion is evil, but because unguarded thought brings us back to the fact that our time is finite and our life is unfinished. That is a hard thing to sit with, and Pascal's examples are often ordinary ones. People chase conversation and games, they chase errands and anything else that keeps them from stopping. That ordinariness is the point. He is not only talking about grand philosophical avoidance, he is talking about the small habits by which a life never has to meet itself directly. A busy hour can be just as evasive as a noisy party, and the empty room is frightening in Pascal because it removes the escape hatches, not forever, and just long enough to show what the escape hatches were doing, and once they are gone, the self becomes visible as a thing that flees. That is uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying, and we start to see that distraction is not random. It has a direction, and it points away from the question we do not want to answer. Pascal keeps us from romanticizing busyness, and motion is not proof of health. Noise is not proof of freedom. Sometimes it is just a way of refusing the room long enough to avoid the thought that would change us. That is why the empty room matters, and it makes evasion visible, and it shows how much of our ordinary life is organized around not stopping. Once you see that, the question is no longer whether the room is pleasant, and it is whether you can remain in it long enough to be honest. Pascal is useful here because he refuses to let us call our distractions harmless. They are not always harmless. Sometimes they are the reason we never hear the sentence that would force a change. The empty room is where that becomes obvious. It is where avoidance stops looking like a personality and starts looking like a strategy. Pascal's severity is useful because it exposes the bargain hidden inside distraction. We pay for constant motion by never having to meet the thought that would rearrange us. The room simply shows the cost. That is the pressure Pascal keeps pressing on. And we keep moving because stopping changes the question, and that is exactly why motion can become a disguise. And stopping is where the trouble starts, because the mind can no longer hide behind motion. But Pascal only gets us part way, and he shows us why the room can feel exposing. Montaigne shows us why retreat does not automatically make us clear. Pascal matters because he refuses to let distraction look innocent. The empty room shows how quickly motion becomes avoidance, and how often noise is not company at all, but a way of staying away from the thought that might change us. So Pascal leaves us with an uncomfortable mercy. You do not have to hate distraction to see what it protects. You only have to ask why the hand reaches outward so quickly when the room finally stops asking for anything. Now, if you've ever gone somewhere quiet, expecting clarity, and found only your own unfinished thoughts waiting there, Montaigne is already in the room with you. He knows retreat can help, but he also knows the self arrives with all of its habits intact. He retires from public life, turns inward, and writes his essays as a long act of self-conversation. That sounds simple until we notice what he refuses to promise, and retreat does not guarantee clarity. The self does not become transparent just because the door is closed, and we like the fantasy that distance will make us clear. But step away from the crowd, and let the noise settle, and then the real self will finally speak. Montaigne does not let us keep that fantasy intact, and he knows that the crowd can keep living in the head. Habit stays, and fear stays, and old performances stay, and the voice of other people is often louder in solitude, not quieter. You have probably felt this yourself. You are finally alone, and instead of relief you hear an entire committee of prior conversations, and the thing you should have said, and the thing they probably meant, and the thing you wish had landed differently. The mind is still social even when the room is empty, and it keeps rehearsing. It keeps editing. It keeps replaying the scene, as though the scene is still happening somewhere just outside the wall. Montaigne does not treat that as a failure, so he treats it as the material of thought. Solitude gives him a place to notice the mind as it actually works, not as it appears in public. We are never just one thing. We are the version that speaks, the version that remembers, the version that worries, the version that wants to look composed. Retreat does not erase those parts, and it makes them audible, and that is why his solitude is human rather than heroic. Here as it is partial, and it is skeptical, and it leaves room for judgment, but it does not promise purity. The mind still carries its habits into the quiet. The room stops interrupting us, and then we hear the patterns we usually mistake for selfhood. A person who thinks they want only silence. What they often want is not silence itself, but a cleaner relation to their own mind. Look, they want the noise outside to stop so the right inner voice can finally become dominant. Montaigne is suspicious of that wish. He has enough wit to know that the self does not arrive in one pure note. It arrives in fragments, in moods, in habits, in the little phrases we use to keep ourselves together. A retreat can help us see those fragments, and it cannot automatically reconcile them, and that matters because the fantasy of escape is always nearby. Imagine if the city is too loud, the answer must be the country, and if people are too tiring, the answer must be solitude. If relationships are too complicated, the answer must be inwardness, and Montaigne is wiser than that. He knows the outer world is not the only source of confusion, and the inner one carries its own weather. Imagine taking a long walk out of town. At first you feel the relief of distance. Think then the body settles, and the mind begins to populate the path with old voices. A phrase from a parent, and a worry from work, and a remembered embarrassment from 10 years ago. A desire to seem wiser than you are, and nothing external is interrupting you, but now the interruption comes from within. Montaigne would say, yes, exactly, and that is the data, and he does not want a purified self. He wants an attentive one, and that difference matters more than it sounds, and purity is a fantasy that often hides more than it reveals. Attention, by contrast, lets the mind appear as it is, not as a clean essence, but as a living process. Solitude gives us access to that process, but only if we are honest enough not to turn the quiet into a theatre of self-improvement. If Pascal makes the room feel like exposure, Montaigne makes it feel like a method of honesty. He wants enough distance to see more clearly, but not so much distance that the thinker begins pretending to be pure. That distinction matters, because purity can become another disguise. It can turn retreat into self-congratulation. It can make the person in the quiet room believe they have become above the crowd, rather than simply more alone with their habits. And Montaigne gives us a different tone. He does not treat solitude like a trap. He treats it like a place where the self can be observed without pretending to be pure. His essays feel like conversation more than verdict, because he is not trying to extract a final essence from the self. He is watching it move and contradict itself until the movement becomes audible. But he is also careful not to romanticize retreat. The voices of the world do not vanish when we are alone, and they get internalized. We carry them with us, often more faithfully than we know, and that is why a quiet afternoon can become a rehearsal room for old arguments. Montaigne does not see that as failure, and he sees it as the truth of being human. The self is not a polished object waiting in the dark, and it is a living traffic of habits, memories, and responses. Montaigne's answer is gentler, but it is not softer in the cheap sense, and he accepts contradiction as part of the self. He does not expect a quiet room to turn him into a transparent being, and he expects it to show him that he is mixed, changeable, and sometimes absurd. That is why his writing feels so alive, and he is not posing as a solved man. That matters because it changes what we think solitude is for, and it is not there to produce purity. It is there to produce honesty. A person alone is often more tempted to myth than to truth, because there is nobody in the room to interrupt the story. Montaigne sees that risk, and he does not avoid it by leaving the room, and he stays inside it until the story becomes visible as a story. Montaigne's gentleness is not softness, it is precision without cruelty. He knows the self is various, not because it is broken, but because it is alive. Solitude lets that variety appear without forcing it into one grand explanation, and that is why his retreat is so useful. It does not hand us a purified identity, it hands us an honest one. We see what recurs, what contradicts itself, and what keeps returning even after we think we have outgrown it. Montaigne keeps the self from becoming a myth of purity. That may be his most valuable gift. He shows that the point of solitude is not to become simpler, but to become more truthful about complexity. When we stop demanding unity too quickly, we start seeing what our habits actually are. Montaigne also leaves us with humility, and the self is not solved by retreat, and it is observed there. That difference matters, because observation is slower than fantasy and more honest than purity. And clarity starts where the fantasy of purity ends, because honesty has to survive contradiction. And he is teaching us how to stay honest in the quiet, even when the mind wants a cleaner story. Honesty survives the quiet if we let it stay long enough to speak, put plainly. And that brings us to the next question. If solitude changes the mind by removing social support, what happens to attention itself when no one is there to witness it? That is where the real texture of aloneness begins to show, and Montaigne gives us the better ambition, not purity, but honesty. Solitude does not solve the self, and it does not need to. It only has to make the self visible enough that we stop mistaking our habits for our nature. And Montaigne keeps that question humane because you may step away from people and still bring their voices with you. We do not become clear by disappearing from the world. We become clearer by watching honestly what follows us into quiet. Now, if you've ever tried to think in private and noticed how fast one sentence can turn into a whole argument, you know attention behaves differently when nobody is there to answer it. It can become cleaner, or it can become more theatrical, and the room itself does not decide which way it goes. That is the sharper question under the quieter one, and without witnesses, attention changes shape. It can sharpen and it can wander, it can spiral, but the same silence that makes one person think more clearly can send another person into a loop. We know this from ordinary life, and a memory comes back with force, and one sentence repeats. One embarrassment grows larger than it was, and one idea turns into 10 because nothing interrupts it. In a conversation, the world pushes back, and alone the mind gets to continue its own motion without correction. That can be a gift, and it can also be a trap. And what changes first is focus, but also the structure of self-monitoring. And when other people are present, we track ourselves partly through their reactions, and we know when we are being too much, too little, too harsh, too vague. Remove that feedback, and the inner editor gets louder, and sometimes that makes us more exact. Sometimes it makes us more self-conscious, and sometimes it makes us harsher than any stranger would be. Think about the difference between writing with and without an audience in mind. And when you know someone will read the line, you choose the words differently. You trim, you clarify, you soften, you sharpen. But when nobody is there, the line keeps moving inside your head in a less governed way. It repeats, mutates loops, and solitude does that to thought, and it removes some of the social breaks. That does not mean attention becomes worse, and it becomes less supervised, and that is a better way to say it. Unsupervised attention can be extraordinary, and it can open a depth of concentration that is almost impossible in public life. It can let us read for an hour without performing. Here is it can let us listen to our own reasoning long enough to find out whether it actually holds together. It can let the mind become exact in a way that social life rarely permits. But the same condition can also magnify what was already there, and if you are anxious, the room can become a hall of echoes. If you are ashamed, the room can become a tribunal. If you are grieving, the room can become a chamber where the absence of one person feels physically present. Look, the room is not inventing those experiences, it is giving them more surface area. That is why the easy sentence, the one that says solitude clears the mind, is only half true. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it gives the mind enough space to settle into a more exact shape. But sometimes that same space lets the mind become more itself than is comfortable. And attention without witnesses is not automatically peace. Imagine it is attention with its social breaks removed, and here is a small but important thought experiment. Try to imagine two versions of the same evening. In the first, you are alone and calm. You read, you think, you notice your own breathing, and the world settles into a useful silence. In the second, you are alone but slightly unsettled, and the same chair now feels too still. Think the same lamp feels too bright. The same silence begins to magnify the sentence you cannot stop hearing in your head. The external conditions are nearly identical, and the internal conditions are not, and that is the point. Solitude does not determine the experience by itself. It reveals what your attention does when it is given more room than usual. This is why being alone can be so valuable for thought and so dangerous for rumination. The difference between the two is not some mystical property of quiet, and it is whether attention is moving towards something or merely circling itself. If it is moving, solitude can be powerful, and if it is circling, solitude can become a loop. The loop matters because it tells us something important about the self, and the self is not always a stable center. Sometimes it is a rhythm, sometimes it is a habit of returning to the same worry in a slightly different form. Sometimes solitude lets that habit show itself plainly, and that can be painful, but it is also useful. It tells us where attention has become captive. When nobody is watching, attention can become more honest, but it can also become more theatrical. We start hearing ourselves think, and sometimes that helps. Sometimes it reveals how often our attention was being shaped by other people's reactions. The mind changes posture when it loses the audience, and it can become cleaner, and it can also become more dramatic. Solitude does not choose between the two for us. But that is why attention without witnesses is such a revealing condition. It shows whether the mind is moving towards something or simply circling itself, and a page can open, a thought can complete itself, and a worry can multiply without resistance. The same silence that lets one idea breathe can let another idea spread. We are dealing with mood, but we are also looking at the mechanics of awareness itself. We can feel the difference in a simple act like reading, and with other people around, the mind often checks itself. Without them, the same page can become deeper or less stable. We slow down, notice more, or drift because nothing is pulling the mind back when it slips. That is why attention without witnesses is not automatically freedom, and it is openness, and openness cuts both ways. But this is also why so many private breakthroughs feel quiet. They do not announce themselves. They happen when the mind finally stays with one thing long enough for the thing to answer back. But the same condition can also make shame feel bigger, and the room gives our thoughts more acoustic space. Some thoughts become clearer because of that, and others become louder than they deserve. And without witnesses, we hear the difference between concentration and rumination more clearly. Concentration tends to move forward, and rumination tends to circle back. And in solitude, both can sound similar for a while. The room only reveals the difference after enough time has passed. But that is why silence is such a revealing test. It shows what we think and how we think. That may be the hardest thing to accept, because it means attention has a shape, and that shape changes when the social world steps back. Attention without witnesses is also where self-monitoring becomes visible, and we notice how often the mind is checking itself against imagined eyes. In solitude, that checking does not disappear. It becomes easier to hear. Once we hear it, we can see how much of thought is shaped by the possibility of being answered. So the real question is whether attention is moving or merely repeating, and solitude makes that visible. It does not choose for us. It just removes enough noise that the shape of the thought can no longer hide. And that is how a quiet room turns into an X-ray, showing what the mind keeps arranging in secret. Attention changes shape when nobody answers back. The mind keeps its own score, and it does so whether we like it or not. And now we arrive at Nietzsche, because Nietzsche takes this same question and pushes it further. Distance from the crowd can liberate thought, yes, but it can also make the mind too sharp for its own good. But that is the real lesson of attention without witnesses. The room does not determine the result, but it exposes the mechanism. Once you can hear how your own mind behaves without an audience, you can start telling the difference between clarity, rumination, and performance. Here is why attention matters so much. If you learn what your mind does without witnesses, you learn something about the shape of your freedom. You also learn where freedom starts to need company again. Now, if you've ever felt smarter the moment you stepped away from the crowd, Nietzsche would ask what that feeling is actually doing to you. Distance can free thought, but it can also make the mind sharpen itself against its own reflection until it confuses force with truth. That reading has some truth in it, but it is too clean, and distance can free thought. Distance can also warp it. Put plainly, what people usually take from Nietzsche is the image of someone leaving the herd behind, but what they miss is the cost of being too far from correction. The same removal that breaks conformity can also make the self harsher, grander, or more unstable than it ought to be. Distance does not only protect, and it distorts. We know the feeling. Step away from the group long enough and you begin to hear your own voice differently. Sometimes it becomes stronger, and sometimes it becomes more suspicious, and sometimes it starts to sound like a crowd of one. That is the danger Nietzsche keeps close. A solitary mind can become clear enough to cut through convention, and it can become severe enough to mistake intensity for truth. He is not against solitude, and he is against easy moralizing about it. And distance from others can loosen social pressure, and social pressure is not always noble. Sometimes the crowd is stupid, and sometimes it is timid, and sometimes it keeps the mind small. But once the pressure is gone, what remains is not automatically wisdom, and it may be pride, it may be wound, it may be a style of self-respect that has nowhere to check itself, the person who leaves a group conversation feeling sharper than everyone else in the room. There is a thrill in that. Here as it can feel like liberation, but it can also become a trap, because the pleasure of being unopposed can start masquerading as insight. Nietzsche understands the temptation. He knows that a mind with no external friction can begin to treat its own force as proof. Try the test after work, when the last message has been answered and nobody is waiting for a reply. Look if the mind settles, that tells us one thing, and if it immediately searches for a new audience, that tells us another. The quiet becomes useful because it stops flattering our habits. And now, we should be careful with Nietzsche here. We are not using him as permission to become cold, superior, or unreachable. We are using him to ask what kind of distance lets a person hear their own values before the crowd speaks over them. And we need that caution, because solitude can sharpen judgment while also narrowing sympathy, and that is one of the strangest risks of solitude. Imagine it can make us feel exceptionally alive, and it can make the self feel taller, more definite, more singular. But singularity is not the same thing as truth. Sometimes what we call depth is only intensity without resistance. So Nietzsche is useful not because he tells us to be alone, but because he warns us that distance changes the temperature of thought. The same solitude that gives clarity can also feed self-importance. Think the same quiet that allows independence can also produce a private mythology. A person who has gone too far away from the crowd may stop noticing the ways their own mind has become a little theatrical. Here is a thought experiment that makes the risk visible, and imagine a writer who isolates themselves to sharpen their thinking. At first it works, and the opinions of the room stop cluttering the page, and the sentences get cleaner. The perceptions get sharper. Then slowly the writer begins to love the feeling of being separate more than the work itself. They start to believe the distance is the point, and they begin to equate lack of interruption with superiority. By the end, the solitude that once served the thought now serves the ego, and Nietzsche would see the trap immediately. That is why he matters here. He keeps reminding us that the solitary mind can become too certain of its own shape. If nobody interrupts the thought, it may start to imagine that interruption was always the enemy. But sometimes interruption is what keeps us honest. We should not pretend this is a small issue. Some of the worst distortions in private life come from exactly this point. The uncorrected mind gets sharper and sharper until it mistakes its own sharpness for authority. That can happen in politics, and it can happen in faith, it can happen in art. It can happen in everyday life when someone spends too long only hearing their own conclusions bounce back at them. So Nietzsche complicates the story. He does not ask us to choose between crowd and solitude in a simple way. He shows that the crowd can dull you and solitude can harden you. And the question is not whether distance is good, the question is whether the distance remains answerable to reality. Nietzsche understands the attraction of distance. If the crowd is loud, lazy, or obedient, stepping away from it can feel like liberation. And in some cases it is. Solitude can give thought enough air to become sharper, more original, and less afraid of approval. It can let a person hear what they actually think instead of what the room expects them to think. That is the promise. But Nietzsche also knows the trap, and distance can harden into superiority. Silence can turn into self-mythology. A person can begin to love the feeling of being outside the crowd more than the work of thinking clearly. Then the solitary mind stops asking whether it is right and starts enjoying how apart it feels. Nietzsche does not want that, and he wants a mind strong enough to stand alone without becoming unanswerable. Nietzsche also helps us see that the solitary mind needs some kind of discipline, and distance alone is not enough. It needs discipline, and otherwise distance turns into resentment, and resentment pretends to be insight. It is easy to dislike the crowd. It is harder to use distance to become more exact instead of more oppositional. That is the difference between strength and posture, and it is a difference the quiet room can easily hide from us. So the best solitude, in Nietzsche's sense, is not withdrawal for its own sake. It is a way of surviving the noise long enough to become capable of judgment again. But judgment still has to come back to the world. If it does not, the mind begins to circle its own force and call that philosophy. Nietzsche would not forgive that mistake for long, and Nietzsche's warning is useful because it keeps distance from becoming a myth. Distance can help thought, and it can also teach contempt, and the solitary mind has to know which one it is feeding. Otherwise it turns its own sharpness into a private religion, and so solitude has to be earned again and again. Not by purity, and by discipline, and by returning from distance with more honesty, not more pride. That is the only version of separation Nietzsche can respect for long. Nietzsche's version of distance only works if it stays answerable. The minute it hardens into a reason never to be challenged, it stops being strength and becomes insulation. Solitude is useful when it makes us more exact, and it becomes dangerous when it makes us more enclosed. That is the line he keeps forcing us to notice, and distance only helps when it returns as clearer judgment. If it comes back as contempt, it has already failed. That is the risk Nietzsche keeps near the surface. The solitary mind can sharpen into insight or harden into a private wall. And the edge is useful only when it stays honest, and strength without return becomes a private illusion, especially when no one can question it. Sharpness needs return, or it turns into something brittle and closed. And that is the bridge to Arendt, who refuses to let us blur all forms of aloneness into one. Nietzsche's warning is simple enough to use and hard enough to live. Distance can help thought, but it can also teach contempt. The point is not to keep close to the crowd. The point is to return from distance with judgment that is sharper and less proud. Look at the danger without losing the gift, because distance can help you hear yourself against the crowd. It can also make your own voice sound larger than it is. Nietzsche forces us to keep both truths in the room. Now, if you've ever noticed that being alone, being lonely, and being isolated feel different in the body before they feel different in the mind, Arendt has given us the right map. She keeps us from collapsing three separate experiences into one vague sadness, and she insists that solitude, loneliness, and isolation are not the same experience. That sounds like a small distinction until you realize how much it changes, and once the words separate, the moral picture changes with them. Solitude for Arendt can support thought, and loneliness is something else. It is more than being by yourself, but it is a break in the common world, a condition where the shared space between people thins or vanishes. Isolation is different again, and it removes the conditions that let thought and speech circulate at all. If we blur these, we miss both the danger and the possibility. You can feel the difference in an ordinary scene. Think of a person who chooses a quiet evening alone because they want to read, write, or simply think. Now think of the same person cut off from friends, work, public life, or language that still feels shared. The room may look the same from outside, and inside it is not the same room at all. One version gives you space, and another takes away the world. That is why her distinction matters so much now. We live in a time that is happy to romanticize solitude and equally happy to pathologize it. But Arendt forces the question back into shape. The same empty room can mean freedom, grief, exile, or injury, depending on how you got there and what else has been taken from you. We often forget that thought itself depends on a common world, and we do not think in a vacuum. We think in language, in memory, in relation, in forms of shared meaning, and a little solitude can make that clearer. Too much isolation can break it, and loneliness can make the world feel hollow from the inside. These are not versions of one mood, and they are different threats, and there is a political edge here that should not be missed. When people are isolated, they become easier to manipulate, and when they are lonely, the common world weakens. When they are in solitude, they can still think, and the distinction is not academic. It is about the conditions under which minds remain free enough to judge. That means the question is not simply, do you like time alone? Look, the deeper question is whether the silence around you still belongs to a world you share with other people, or whether the silence has started to break that world apart. Those are very different realities, even if the same chair is sitting by the same window. Here is a thought experiment that makes Arendt's point concrete, and picture 3 nights in the same room. On the first night, you choose the room because you need to write. On the second, you are lonely because someone important has gone missing from your life, and the room feels bigger than it should. Imagine on the third, you are isolated because the common structures that connected you to others have gone weak, and you no longer trust the voices coming back from the world. Same lamp, and same walls, and same silence, but the meaning of your aloneness changes completely. That difference matters because each condition asks for a different response, and solitude may be fruitful. Loneliness may need reconnection, and isolation may need repair of the common world itself, and if we call them all the same thing, we start prescribing the wrong remedy. Now look at what that does to our original question, and we started by asking whether being alone reveals the self. Think Arendt would say the answer depends on the kind of aloneness we mean, and some versions give the self room to think. Some versions shrink the world until thought loses its footing, and the words matter because the reality behind them matters. Arendt matters because she refuses the blur, and solitude is one condition, and loneliness is another. Isolation is another again, and we need those distinctions because the shared world does real work in our thinking. We do not judge in a vacuum, we do not speak in a vacuum. Even when we are alone, the language we use and the meanings we trust come from a world we share with others. Solitude can still belong to that world, and loneliness can feel like the world is thinning. Isolation can make the world stop feeling shared at all. That is why her distinction has political force as well as personal force. When people are cut off from one another, they become easier to manage, easier to mislead, easier to flatten into private fragments. Arendt is protecting a feeling, but she is also protecting the conditions that let people remain thinkable to themselves and to each other. The room is personal, yes, but it is also civic, and what happens inside it matters outside it. Arendt's language about plurality matters here, and we are not built to think only from inside ourselves. We need a world of shared speech, and that is why solitude can support thought without replacing community. It gives thought a private room, not a private universe, and loneliness and isolation threaten that larger world in different ways. One hollows it out, the other can remove it. That is also why her distinction feels more urgent in modern life, where so much contact is thin. We can be surrounded by messages and still lose the common world, and we can be interrupted constantly and still be isolated. Arendt's point is not that aloneness is always dangerous. It is that the kind of aloneness determines whether the self can still answer to others at all. Arendt reminds us that the world is not only made of objects, and it is made of shared meanings. Solitude can deepen that world by giving thought room to breathe. Loneliness can shrink it by cutting us off from the relation that keeps meaning alive. Isolation is the hardest one, because it can make the world feel unusable, and then the self no longer meets a common world. It meets only itself, and even that meeting becomes unstable, and that is why her distinction is not decorative. It protects the conditions of thought. Arendt's larger point is that thought is never only private. It depends on a world of common meanings that solitude can clarify but not create on its own. That is why her distinctions matter so much. They keep us from treating every private room as if it were enough by itself. Arendt's point is that a common world is not optional decoration, and it is part of how thought remains sane and shared. Solitude can be a room inside that world, and it should not become a substitute for the world itself. That distinction keeps the common world intact. The shared world is what keeps thought from shrinking, because plurality gives our thinking a horizon, and plurality keeps thought alive, because one voice alone is too easy to mistake for truth. So the room matters, but the room is not the whole story, and who chose it matters. What was removed matters, and whether the common world remains matters. That leaves us with a harder question. What kind of self keeps arriving when the room stays empty long enough to become a habit rather than a moment? Arendt keeps the map honest, and solitude, loneliness, and isolation are not interchangeable moods. They are different conditions with different demands. If we keep them separate, we stop giving the wrong remedy to the wrong silence. Imagine carrying Arendt's distinction into an ordinary week because some hours alone give thought back to you. Some hours alone tell you that the common world has thinned. We have to know which kind of silence we are hearing. Now, if you've ever experienced a quiet room as comfort one day and punishment the next, you already know the meaning of silence depends on who chose it. Arendt keeps that distinction sharp because power changes everything about the same looking room, and that question changes almost everything. A chosen withdrawal and a forced exclusion may look similar from far away, and inside they are worlds apart. The first can open thought, and the second can wound it, and the first can be a practice, the second can be a loss. But put plainly, we are too quick to turn solitude into an ideal, because the ideal version is easier to admire than the real one. The ideal version has candles and notebooks and a calm window. The real version can include grief, job loss, estrangement, illness, poverty, caregiving, burnout, or social exclusion. The same quiet can mean rest or abandonment depending on the forces that brought it there. And you can feel that difference in your body before you can name it, and chosen withdrawal tends to feel spacious at first, and forced exclusion tends to feel like a thinning of the world, and one expands attention, the other narrows it. One gives you a chance to meet your own mind. The other can make you feel as though the mind is all that remains because the rest of life has been quietly removed. This is where power enters the picture, and not every empty room is a private choice. So not every silence is restorative, and not every retreat is wise, and some people are alone because they wanted the room, some because the room was imposed on them, and some because life broke the social pattern that once held them in place. We cannot moralize over all of that as if it were the same condition. At the same time, the chosen version still matters. There is a kind of withdrawal that allows thought to gather itself without severing the person from the world. Here is writers know this, and artists know this. Philosophers know this. Ordinary people know this when they deliberately set aside an hour or a day so that the noise can stop long enough for them to hear their own mind. But here is the catch, and even chosen withdrawal can become something else if we are not careful. It can become concealment. Look, it can become avoidance dressed up as wisdom. It can become a way of refusing the messy obligations of relationship while still calling ourselves reflective. So we need to be honest about the spectrum, and solitude is not a single moral category. It is a condition that changes meaning under pressure, and chosen withdrawal can enlarge the mind. Forced exclusion can shrink it, and the same room can hold either truth, and the same quiet can nourish thought or expose a wound. Imagine the difference is not in the furniture, and it is in the forces that brought you there. Let's slow it down into a scene, and one person shuts the door because they want to think. Another hears the door close and knows the day has closed off from them, and one person experiences relief. Another experiences decline. From the outside, both may look like being alone. From the inside, the two experiences belong to different worlds. Think that is why it is too crude to praise solitude in general. Praise has to be earned by conditions. If someone is being forced into loneliness or isolation, telling them to appreciate the quiet is not wisdom, it is confusion. On the other hand, if someone is drowning in external noise and cannot hear themselves think, a chosen withdrawal may be exactly what they need. The point is not to make solitude sacred or suspicious, and the point is to see it accurately. The same quiet can mean very different things depending on how it arrived. A monk, a writer, a philosopher, or a parent, taking an hour after everyone is asleep, enters one kind of silence. Exile, rejection, and grief create another. From the outside, both can look like being alone. From the inside, one opens thought while the other can close it down, and power changes the meaning of the room. And even chosen withdrawal has to be handled carefully. We can use it to protect attention, or we can use it to hide from obligations we do not want to face. Solitude is not automatically noble just because it was chosen, but forced exclusion is not a spiritual test either. If we keep those apart, we stop romanticizing pain and stop dismissing the real usefulness of self-chosen quiet. The distinction keeps us honest, and the different textures of quiet, and a library and a cabin. A long walk can be quiet. A hospital room can be quiet. A locked apartment can be quiet too, but the forces behind them are not the same. One quiet invites thought, and another can feel imposed on the mind, and that difference is not emotional decoration, it is the center of the thing. So we should be careful whenever we praise solitude. We should ask who gets to choose it, who gets pushed into it, and what kind of life has room to treat it as a virtue. Otherwise, we turn privilege into philosophy. And we should be just as careful not to dismiss every self-chosen withdrawal as avoidance. Sometimes stepping back is how a person keeps from being swallowed by noise, and a chosen room gives you a threshold you can cross back over. A forced room can feel like there is no threshold at all, and that is the difference power makes. It changes whether silence feels open or shut. So we should never tell the story of solitude as if everybody enters it the same way. Some people step back on purpose, and others are left behind, and some use quiet to think, others are left with quiet as proof of loss. Those are not equivalent experiences, and the argument collapses if we pretend they are. The hardest thing to remember is that the same silence can be either protection or punishment. That depends on permission, power, and timing, and a room chosen freely can open thought. A room imposed by life can shrink it, and the silence may sound similar. The meaning is not. And because power changes the meaning of silence, we have to ask who benefits from calling all aloneness the same thing. A chosen retreat and an imposed absence do not teach the same lesson, and treating them as identical erases the difference between agency and injury. Permission changes the meaning of every quiet room. Choice and injury cannot be collapsed into one mood. Permission changes everything, since a chosen withdrawal and an imposed one do not mean the same thing. Once we see it accurately, another question appears. What happens when the self keeps arriving in fragments each time the room goes quiet? That is where the experience becomes intimate rather than abstract. So the deeper question is not whether the room is empty, it is who made it empty and what that emptiness is asking the person inside it to bear. Choice and injury can look similar from far away, but they do not mean the same thing. Think about the door again, because the question is not only whether it is closed, the question is who closed it and whether a path back remains. That is where solitude stops being a mood and becomes a condition of life. Now, if you've ever sat in silence and found that you were not one self but several habits taking turns, that experience is the honest beginning of this question. Solitude does not invent the fragments. It makes their arrangement impossible to ignore. What if it keeps arriving in pieces when no one else is in the room? That is what solitude often reveals, and not a single pure inner person, but a sequence of returns. But memory returns, and fear returns. Old phrasing returns. The voice that says, "We are behind unworthy late or unfinished returns," with a stubborn patience. This is why solitude can feel like a test, not because it asks us to perform, and because it strips away the usual pressure that lets the self stay distributed across the world. In company we are partly held together by response, and alone we hear the internal fragments more clearly. Sometimes that is clarifying, and sometimes it is destabilizing. Sometimes it feels like we are meeting ourselves. Sometimes it feels like we are meeting versions of ourselves we would rather not know. So we often go looking for authenticity in solitude, as if the crowd were the thing making us false. That is too simple, because the crowd can distort us, but the self does not become instantly true once it is alone. The private voice can be a witness, and it can also become a jailer. The silence can reveal, or it can multiply the self into contradictory parts that compete for the microphone. Think about how the mind behaves when the room is quiet enough for it to start sorting through itself. Here is one memory triggers another. One worry gives shape to a second worry. Then comes a story about who you are, and then a second story about why that story is true. The room keeps getting louder, but now it is the self making the noise. There is no audience left except the one inside you, and that audience is not always kind. Look, that is why so many people find solitude uncanny, and not because nothing is there, but because too much is there. The self does not arrive as a clean essence, and it arrives as an atmosphere. You feel it in the tone of your attention. You feel it in what you keep returning to. You feel it in the way the mind leans towards some thoughts and away from others. Here is a thought experiment. Sit in the quiet for an hour with no agenda except to notice what keeps coming back. Not to fix it and not to judge it, and just to notice it. And you might discover that the same question circles around 3 disguises. You might discover that the same regret keeps changing clothes. You might discover that the person you call me is less a solid object and more a pattern of repeated arrivals. Think that does not mean there is no self, and it means the self is more complicated than the popular version suggests. There is not a single hidden core waiting patiently behind the noise. There is a pattern of returns, habits of attention, and ways of responding to absence. Being alone can expose those patterns, but it can also intensify them, and that is why the experience can feel both revealing and uncanny. And this is the place where people often make the wrong move, and they see the fragments and assume solitude has failed. But what if the fragments are the truth? What if the point of being alone is not to discover a single perfectly stable identity, but to see the ways in which identity is assembled and maintained? That is a harder answer, but it is a better one, and Pascal would say the mind is restless. Montaigne would say the mind is various, and Nietzsche would say the mind can become too certain of its own force. Arendt would say the conditions around the mind matter more than we think. Put them together and a different picture emerges. Solitude is not where the self is finally purified. It is where the self becomes visible in motion, and the self does not always appear as one thing. It arrives in fragments, and the person who remembers, and the person who is ashamed, the person who wants to be seen, the person who wants to disappear, the person who is trying to hold a conversation with yesterday's version of themselves. Solitude lets those parts come forward without the usual social sorting, and that can feel like truth. It can also feel like crowding. But that is why the idea of a single hidden core is too neat for lived experience. We are assembled over time and kept together by habit, language, memory, and relation. When the room gets quiet, those supports become more obvious, not less. Sometimes that means the self becomes clearer, and sometimes it means the self becomes noisier. The point is not that one of those is fake. The point is that the self is more like a pattern of returns than a solid statue waiting inside us. A solitary hour can feel like meeting yourself, but what often appears is a sequence of selves. The one who is hungry, and the one who is embarrassed, and the one who is ambitious, the one who wants to be left alone, and the one who wants to be seen. None of them is the whole story, yet in silence they stop being hidden by the social choreography that usually keeps them in line. But that is why solitude can be so revealing and so destabilizing at once. And it is not simply that the real self steps forward, it is that the arrangement becomes visible. We notice which parts of us are rehearsed, which parts are defensive, and which parts only exist because other people have given them a name. The room does not create that complexity, it gives it room. The self that arrives in silence is often the self that was hidden by motion, not the final self, and the exposed one, and the one with unfinished sentences attached to it. That is why solitude can feel like a confrontation rather than a discovery. But confrontation is useful if we do not turn away too quickly. It shows us that identity is kept together by repetition, not by essence alone, and the room does not invent those repetitions. It reveals them one by one until we can no longer pretend they are the same thing as certainty. What arrives in silence is often not a hidden essence, but a pattern of coordination. This voice follows that voice, and that fear triggers that story, and that memory calls up that role. Solitude makes the pattern visible, and it does not invent it, and that is why the room can feel both revealing and unsettling. The self arrives in pieces because it was built in pieces. Roles and memories come with it. Habits and fears do too when the room goes still. Solitude makes that assembly line visible, and it does not create the parts, and it reveals how they keep meeting. The room does not invent the fragments, and it reveals them, and silence does not invent the self. It separates its pieces, which is how the arrangement becomes visible, and pieces are still pieces, which is why silence reveals arrangement rather than essence. Once you see that you can ask a stronger question, and what can solitude honestly give us, and what can it never give, that is the bridge to the next part. But that is why the self in solitude is never a finished object. It keeps arriving in parts, and the room lets us see the parts without pretending they are one pure thing. That visibility is uncomfortable, but it is also where real self-knowledge begins. Now the self that arrives is not always noble, and it is not always false. Sometimes it is a memory asking for attention because sometimes it is fear using your voice. Solitude matters because it lets us hear the difference. Now, if you've ever come away from a quiet hour feeling clearer but not cured, then you already understand the boundary here. Solitude can make thought more legible, but it cannot do the whole job of being human by itself. That is the first truth. It can give enough distance to notice what social life hides. It can give enough quiet to hear a thought finish before someone else interrupts it. But it can give enough separation to make judgment possible when the crowd is too loud. It can also give a different kind of dignity, not the dignity of performance, the dignity of no longer having to arrange every feeling around the eyes of other people. There is a freedom in that, and we should say so plainly, and a person who is never alone can become dependent on the social mirror for every sense of shape. A person who is sometimes alone can begin to see where the mirror helps and where it distorts. You may know this already, and the first half hour after people leave can feel like relief. The next half hour can feel like self-recovery, and you start hearing your own rhythm again. You stop managing your face, so you stop arranging your responses. You begin to notice what you actually think instead of what you thought was expected. That is real and it matters, and solitude can make the mind less performative and more precise. But solitude cannot give everything people want from it, and it cannot guarantee peace, and it cannot guarantee truth. It cannot repair a life by itself. Here is it cannot make the self coherent if the self is already fractured by grief or fear. It cannot turn every silence into wisdom. That is the limit we keep trying not to see. We want solitude to do more than it can do because the promise is attractive. If the room could fix us, the whole problem would be easier. But the room is not a cure. Look, it is a condition, and sometimes it helps thought. Sometimes it reveals what thought cannot solve. Sometimes it makes the mind more precise, and sometimes it makes the mind more severe. Let's make that concrete, and imagine you have been overloaded for weeks, and too many inputs, too many obligations, and too many voices, and the dream is simple, a quiet room and enough time to think. Imagine you finally get it. For a while the silence helps. Then, if there is unresolved grief underneath the busyness, the silence will not erase it. It will simply let you hear it, and that is not failure, and it is the room doing what it does best. So the best answer is not to praise solitude or to fear it, and it is to understand its shape. Think the room can make thought possible, and it can also make thought stranger, and it can open self-knowledge. It can also produce self-deception, and it can give freedom from the crowd, and it can also leave us with no crowd to correct us, and we should not miss the practical consequence of that. If the room changes the mind this much, then solitude is not a little habit on the edge of life. It is one of the conditions that determines whether your thoughts are arriving freely defensively or under pressure. The lesson is not to avoid the room, and it is to enter it honestly. Here is another thought experiment, and suppose two people get the same weekend alone. One uses it to think, read and recover. The other uses it to avoid a difficult truth they have been postponing for months. From the outside, both may say they had a peaceful weekend, but the inner result is not the same. One person returned with more clarity, and the other returned with more polished avoidance, and solitude did not decide between them. It only gave both people enough room to show who they were becoming, and that is the honest version of the story. Solitude is powerful because it does not lie, and it amplifies what is already moving through the self. If what is already moving is attention, it can deepen it, and if it is avoidance, it can deepen that too. If it is self-respect, it can stabilize it, and if it is self-importance, it can make that feel heroic. So we should stop treating solitude like a moral trophy, and it is not automatically noble to be alone. It is not automatically healthy to seek quiet. It is not automatically wise to withdraw. The question is what the withdrawal does to the mind, and whether the mind can still answer to reality when the room is silent. Put plainly, that is what the philosophers we have followed are all trying to protect. Pascal wants us to notice how quickly we run. Montaigne wants us to notice how much company the mind carries into quiet. Nietzsche wants us to notice that distance can sharpen and distort at the same time. Arendt wants us to stop confusing solitude with loneliness or isolation. Once you hold all of that together, solitude stops being a slogan and becomes a field of tension. Solitude can give us room, and that is not a small thing, and it can give proportion. It can give a little distance from performance, and it can let a thought finish before we answer it. It can make judgment less reactive, but it cannot carry the whole burden of life. It cannot repair grief by itself, and it cannot guarantee truth, and it cannot turn the self into a finished object. We ask too much of it when we turn it into a cure, and that is the boundary we keep meeting. The room can help us hear what is there. It cannot tell us what to do with every sound. It can show us our own confusion, our own avoidance, our own hunger for escape. That is useful, and it is also incomplete. Friendship, language, work, and return still matter. If solitude teaches anything, it is that clarity and relation belong together more often than we want to admit. What solitude cannot do is just as important as what it can do, and it cannot substitute for friendship. It cannot replace a common world. It cannot make a broken life whole by itself. The room can help us hear what is happening inside us, but it cannot be the only thing that answers us. If it were, we would mistake private resonance for truth, but that is why the best version of solitude is modest. It gives enough distance for thought, then sends thought back into relation. It is a pause, not a destination. A person who can be alone without becoming sealed off from others has gained something real. But even there, the gain is incomplete unless the mind can return and speak, work and listen again. Solitude can help us become less performative, and that alone is valuable. But the moment we ask it to replace the world, it fails. It was never meant to be a substitute for contact, only a condition that makes contact clearer when we return to it. But that is the limit worth keeping in mind, and the quiet can prepare us for relation. It cannot become relation, and it can clear the channel. It cannot be the message. When we forget that, we start asking silence to do the work of a human life. Solitude can prepare us for relation, but it cannot stand in for it, and that is the boundary worth guarding. The room can help us become less reactive, less performative, and more precise. It cannot be the whole answer to a human life that still has to speak, listen, and be answered by other people. But that is why solitude should stay modest. It is powerful when it is used as a condition, not a claim. The moment we ask it to do everything, we stop seeing what it can actually do and what must still come from elsewhere. That boundary is what keeps the question honest. The room is a condition, not a cure. The room is not the world, and we should never ask it to do that much. And that tension leads to the final synthesis. Because if being alone changes the mind this much, then what does that mean for the rest of life? The boundary matters because it keeps solitude useful, and it can make thought clearer and less performative. It can make attention more precise, but it cannot replace relation, repair the shared world, or do the work of love for us. Once that is clear, we stop asking the room to do a job it was never meant to do. But a limit is not a failure. Solitude can give space, attention, and honesty. It cannot become the whole world without damaging the person it was supposed to help. That is why the game and the boundary belong together. Now, if you've ever needed quiet to think and company to stay human, you already know the real question is proportion. The point is not to praise aloneness or fear it, but to understand what it is doing to the rest of life. And when we name it that way, we can stop asking whether being alone is good in the abstract. We have to ask whether the quiet is helping us think or simply helping us avoid the next hard thing. We have to ask whether we are gathering ourselves or just giving our echo more space. So the real question is no longer whether solitude is pleasant. The question is whether we can meet the room honestly. We can tell the difference between the silence that lets thought settle and the silence that only makes avoidance look cleaner. We can also tell the difference between a mind that is becoming clearer and a mind that is becoming more private than it should be. But the gain is real. Solitude can give us a little more distance from performance. Let us hear what we actually think before the social world trims every sentence, and make judgment slower when that slowness is exactly what we need. And we are not trying to leave the world, and we are trying to return to it with something less scattered. Now we can say the limit just as plainly. Solitude cannot guarantee peace, repair grief by itself, force truth into place, or turn every silent hour into wisdom. The room can help thought gather itself, but it can also expose what thought cannot solve. Look, that is why the question stays open, so we do not need to pretend that one answer covers every life. We need to admit that the same condition can reveal one person and distort another. That is not a weakness in the argument, that is the argument. A life with enough solitude to think, but not so much that the common world disappears. That is the balance worth wanting. Not endless noise, not endless withdrawal, but enough room for the mind to become legible and enough return for the mind to stay answerable. So the convergence is this. Being alone changes thought, selfhood, and attention because it changes the conditions under which the self has to meet itself. What remains open is how much solitude each of us can bear before the room stops clarifying and starts enclosing. So here is the converging point. Being alone changes mood, but it also changes the conditions under which the self has to meet itself. Look, without witnesses, our inner scripts become easier to hear. Without interruption, our habits become easier to notice. Without the quick correction of other people, our attention reveals what it has been leaning toward all along. That is why solitude can feel revelatory, and it also explains why it can feel exposing, and that gives us the real shape of the question. Imagine we are not asking whether solitude is good in the abstract. We are asking when it reveals, when it distorts, and how to tell the difference before we turn either one into a doctrine. That is the burden the room places on us, and not to worship it, not to fear it, to read it accurately enough that we know what kind of life it is asking us to live. Think at the end of all this, the biggest mistake would be to treat solitude as a personality trait. It is not a badge, and it is not a fixed moral position. It is a condition that changes what the mind has to do. That is why the same person can need it one week and resist it the next. The question is not whether we are the kind of person who likes being alone. The question is what the room does to our attention when we are in it. And that keeps the argument honest. We are not looking for a slogan that works in every life. We are looking for a way to tell whether silence is helping the self become legible or helping it become narrower. That is a sharper question than the one we began with. It asks for judgment, not identity. It asks us to read the room before we start worshipping it or running from it. So the convergence is not a slogan, it is a proportion. We need enough solitude to hear ourselves, but not so much that the common world disappears. We need enough quiet to notice our habits, but not so much that the habits become our only company. That balance is the real question, and not whether solitude is good, whether it stays answerable, whether it keeps us in contact with other people, with language, and with the part of reality that never belongs to one mind alone. So the proportion is the whole issue, and too little solitude and thought gets drowned in noise. Too much, and the common world starts to thin. And the question is not which extreme we prefer in the abstract. It is how to keep enough quiet for clarity, and enough relation for reality. And so the honest answer is not, be alone more. It is know what aloneness is doing here. That keeps the question alive, and keeps the room from becoming either a shrine or a threat. So the argument stays precise instead of becoming a slogan, and proportion is the thing we keep trying to learn. And measure matters here, because solitude becomes useful only when it stays in proportion. And that is why we cannot turn the ending into a slogan. We can only keep the question alive, because the room is not a single event. It is a condition that keeps revealing the measure of the mind. So the convergence is proportion. Enough solitude to hear yourself, enough relation to stay human, and enough honesty to know when the balance has gone wrong. That is the shape of the question once the slogans fall away because, and this is the honest convergence, the empty room teaches us something real, but it does not become a kingdom. We return from solitude with sharper attention, not with permission to abandon the shared world that shaped it. Now, if you've ever tried to do real work in a room full of interruption, you know why solitude matters beyond philosophy. Judgment needs sequence, and sequence needs a mind that can stay with one thing long enough to finish it, and work gives us a clean way to see the cost. We lose sequence, and we lose the ability to hold one problem long enough for it to become one problem instead of 10 fragments. When attention is constantly interrupted, judgment gets shallow and the mind starts reacting instead of thinking. So solitude at work is not a luxury in the decorative sense. It is the condition that lets a thought finish what it started. We need that continuity if we want to understand a problem before we answer it too quickly. Otherwise we stay in motion and call it progress. But we should also keep the warning in view. And if we are alone with work all the time, we can start to think interruption is the enemy. It is not, and other minds correct us, and other voices keep us from hardening into private certainty. Solitude helps only if it serves return, not retreat. Now we can make that concrete. Imagine a person sitting down after a long day and finally getting 30 quiet minutes, so we can feel the relief immediately. The shoulders drop and the mind stops jumping. We can also feel the temptation immediately. The phone comes up, a tab opens, a task appears, and anything is easier than meeting the unfinished thought. Look, that is the whole test. Can we stay long enough to hear our own thought complete a sentence, remain with a problem without escaping the moment it becomes uncomfortable, and tell the difference between focus and hiding? Those are not abstract questions, and they are the shape of modern work. Imagine you test the claim in one ordinary evening. Here is, you put the phone down, you stop explaining yourself for a while, and you notice which thoughts keep asking for witnesses. We do not have to call that wisdom, but we can call it evidence, because the room is showing us what our public life usually hides. The difference between motion and judgment. Motion looks productive because it is visible, while judgment is quieter and usually begins when the noise has finally dropped enough for us to see what is actually there. That is why we need solitude without turning it into a fantasy, and so the room at work is not empty. Look, it is a place where attention is either recovered or lost, and that is the practical version of the argument. Work shows the usefulness of solitude in a very clean way, and a problem often cannot be solved in fragments. It needs sequence. It needs enough uninterrupted time for one thought to lead to the next without being cut off every 30 seconds. That is why a quiet hour at a desk can feel more productive than a whole day of visible motion. Imagine the mind gets to stay with one thing long enough for judgment to happen, but work also exposes the temptation. If we love solitary focus too much, we can start to believe interruption is always the enemy. It is not, and other minds correct us, and other voices stop us from turning private certainty into method. So the best version of solitude at work is not isolation. Think it is continuity with enough openness left in it that the thought can still be answered by reality, by criticism, and by the next harder question. Work also shows why solitude needs a return path, and a decision made in complete isolation can become brittle. A draft written without interruption can be strong, but it still needs another eye, and the point of quiet is not to make the self sovereign. It is to make one line of thought long enough to be testable, and that is the difference between isolation and concentration. We feel this in real work all the time. The strategy memo waits. So does the difficult conversation. So does the unfinished sentence. None of them gets better because we are vaguely busy. They get better because the mind has been given enough room to complete a chain. Solitude serves that chain. But if it becomes a permanent retreat, it stops being a tool and starts becoming a hiding place. Work makes the case for solitude in a very practical way, and a mind interrupted too often cannot hold a line long enough to test it. But that is why the best work often needs a protected stretch of silence, and not because silence is sacred, because judgment needs continuity. But continuity is not the same as withdrawal, and the point is to complete a thought and then let it meet the world. A memo, a decision, a strategy, a hard conversation, all of them improve when the mind is given enough room to become coherent first. Work makes this visible because it punishes fragmentation. A mind that cannot stay with one thing long enough to finish it cannot make judgment. Solitude gives sequence back to thought. That is why it matters in strategy, writing, and any task that needs a line of reasoning instead of a pile of reactions. At work, that means protecting sequence long enough for judgment to happen, and without sequence, we only react. With it, we can actually think. So that is the practical case for solitude. It gives thought enough continuity to become useful. Judgment needs that stretch of uninterrupted time. One thought needs room to finish before the next one starts. Otherwise, work becomes reaction in a suit, and continuity makes judgment possible because fragments can only react, not decide. And that practical version matters because it tells us the mind is not broken by busyness alone, and it is fragmented by lack of room. At work, this becomes very concrete. A mind that cannot stay with one thing long enough to finish it cannot judge well. Solitude gives sequence back to thought, and sequence is what lets work become something more than a pile of reactions. Now, if you've ever lost 30 minutes to a feed and come away less yourself than you were before, you already know the digital world makes solitude harder to keep. It keeps borrowing your attention until the mind forgets what continuity feels like. That matters because solitude means the absence of people and the absence of continuous recruitment. If every spare second is filled by feeds, fragments, and replies, the self never really returns to itself. The room becomes a transit area instead of a room, and the problem is not technology by itself. So the deeper problem is the way attention is continuously borrowed. A person can be alone in the physical sense, and still never be in solitude, because the mind is always somewhere else. But the answer is not a heroic retreat. It is discipline. Put the phone down long enough for the room to become a room again, and let the mind finish a sentence without being pulled into the next one. That small act feels radical now because so much of modern life is built to make continuity hard. Now we can say what gets lost when we never do that. We lose contact with the texture of our own thought. We feel busy but not coherent, connected but not accompanied, stimulated but not truly present. Look, a feed can fill a spare second very quickly. It cannot always give the mind what it actually needs. Sometimes it only gives us enough noise to avoid hearing what we were about to notice. The difference between being interrupted and being rented out. Interruption is a moment, while rented attention becomes a habit. Solitude is the refusal to let every empty second be claimed by the next fragment. So digital solitude is not mystical. It is the choice to let attention come back from the market of other people's fragments. The phone makes a counterfeit version of company. It also makes a counterfeit version of solitude. We can be alone in a room and still be recruited by other people's fragments every few seconds. The result is not real relation, and it is not real stillness, and it is borrowed attention. That is why the mind feels thin after too much scrolling, and it has been kept in motion without ever being allowed to gather itself. Digital solitude is so not a dramatic retreat. It is the smaller act of refusing constant recruitment. It is letting attention come back from the market of replies, clips and notifications long enough to discover its own shape again. That may sound simple. It is not. A mind that is always being interrupted starts to forget what it feels like to be continuous. Solitude in the digital age is the defense of continuity. Digital life makes the old problem harder because it keeps offering the appearance of relation. A feed feels alive, messages feel like contact, but the mind can go an entire evening without ever being in one place for long enough to think a complete thought. That is why the room now has to fight for itself, and it is competing with 1,000 small invitations to leave. The result is fragmentation, not only distraction, and we begin to feel that any empty second belongs to someone else's rhythm. Solitude is the refusal of that claim, and it says the mind can belong to itself long enough to become coherent again. Not forever, and just long enough to notice what it has been giving away. And the digital world is built to keep us slightly outside ourselves, just enough stimulation to prevent stillness, and just enough response to prevent depth. That is why a quiet room with a phone in it is not really quiet anymore, because the mind remains on call. Solitude in that world is the refusal to be perpetually available to fragments. It is not a grand gesture, it is the recovery of a line of thought long enough for the line to become one thing. Without that, the self gets trained to live in pieces, and the digital world keeps offering quick fragments in place of sustained thought. That is why solitude now has to be defended as continuity and not withdrawal from the world. Continuity inside it. The mind has to be allowed to hold one thread long enough to discover whether it is thinking or just being pulled. Digital life tries to keep every gap occupied. Solitude refuses that occupation. It protects the gap long enough for thought to return and for attention to remember that it can belong to one thing at a time. Continuity is the thing the feed keeps interrupting. The feed keeps offering fragments where continuity should be. Fragments are not enough, because the mind needs continuity if it is going to remain itself, and that choice is small only until we notice how much of the self it protects. Digital life makes the final point obvious. If attention is always being borrowed, solitude has to be protected on purpose. The mind needs continuity long enough to notice what it thinks before the feed pulls it apart again. So the workplace and the screen both test the same question. Can you be briefly unseen without disappearing from yourself? Can you step away from reaction long enough to choose a response before the world asks for another one? Now, if you've ever discovered that grief and love both need room but not the same kind, you already know silence is doing more than removing sound. It can hold absence gently, or it can keep one person from being asked to carry another person's lack. And in grief, we can ask a simpler question first. Is the silence allowing breath to slow, or is it tightening everything? Is the mind returning to itself, or is it looping around the same absence until the room feels too sharp to stay in? But those are survival questions, not poetic ones, and so solitude in grief cannot be reduced to advice. Sometimes being alone lets the body settle enough to feel what happened. Sometimes it magnifies the loss until the room feels almost too sharp. The same silence can help or hurt depending on what is already breaking open inside it. But love gives us another angle. And in a healthy relationship, each person remains separate enough to stand alone without collapsing. That separation protects intimacy, because without it, love can drift into dependency, and dependency can feel like closeness while it is really fear. Now we can widen the room a little and include aging, and as life gets older, silence can mean something different again. Sometimes the world narrows in a natural way. Sometimes it narrows because people disappear, habits break, or the social world stops making as much room. So those are not the same thing, and look, the older room can be a place of unusual honesty. What remains when performance matters less? What remains when the crowd is no longer the main audience? If the self can still think, judge, and return to relation, then solitude may become clearer with age rather than weaker. Quickly we flatten all of this into one mood. Here is we say someone is alone, and we assume we know the meaning. We do not, because the difference between grief, love, and aging lives in the forces that brought the person into the room and the kind of silence that remains. So the point is not that solitude solves grief or protects love by itself. The point is that the room tells the truth about what kind of relation is still possible. Grief changes the room more than almost anything else. Look, a quiet house after loss is not neutral, because it can feel like the absence has taken a shape. Solitude in grief sometimes helps because it gives the body enough safety to feel what has happened without the pressure of performing composure. But it can also make the absence louder than we can bear, and the same room can cradle grief or magnify it. Love adds another layer. To love well, we have to remain separate enough to stand on our own. Imagine if we cannot be alone at all, then closeness can become neediness, and neediness can masquerade as intimacy. There is a strange truth here. Solitude protects love by preventing us from turning the other person into a life support system. The room teaches us that relation without separation is not love, it is fear with better language. Grief shows us that silence is not empty because it is full of the absent person. Think that can be unbearable, but it can also be the only place where the loss becomes real enough to be lived with. So solitude in grief is not a cure, and it is a container, and sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it is not, but it is different from pretending the absence is not there. Love needs a related discipline too. If you cannot stand your own company, you are likely to turn the other person into an answer to your emptiness. But that is too much weight for any person to carry, and solitude protects love by preserving separateness. It lets two people remain distinct enough to meet rather than merge, and without that, even tenderness can turn into dependence. Grief often asks for solitude because grief is awkward around performance, and we do not always need company. Sometimes we need the room to stop pretending that absence is small, and silence can make the loss feel real enough to carry. Love needs something similar, not the loss, but the space. A person who can be alone is less likely to demand that love do all the work of being whole. That makes love cleaner, because it stops asking another person to solve an emptiness that should never have been handed to them. Grief and love both teach that silence is never empty. It is full of relation, either present or absent. So that is why solitude can help us grieve, and also keep us from asking another person to carry the shape of our lack. It gives feeling a place to breathe without turning it into demand. In grief, silence can hold the shape of loss without making a spectacle of it. In love, silence keeps one person from being asked to carry the other's incompleteness. Both need the same thing in different forms: room. Room is what both grief and love keep asking for, because absence has a shape, and quiet lets us feel it without forcing another person to carry all of it. And that is why the same silence can be mercy for one person and pressure for another. In grief and love, the room is never just empty because it carries absence, memory, and expectation at once. Solitude helps when it gives feeling somewhere to rest, but it fails when it asks another person to become the whole answer. This is why the final practical question is how to keep solitude honest rather than heroic. In grief, the room may give pain enough space to be felt without performance, while in love, it may protect the separateness that lets two people meet without using each other as shelter. In age, it may reveal what remains when the old audience is gone. But in every case, the test is the same. Is the quiet making relation more truthful, or is it replacing relation altogether? That question keeps the whole subject from becoming a slogan, because solitude is not a badge, a cure, or a proof of depth. It is a condition that changes attention, and sometimes it opens the mind, while sometimes it closes it around one wound, one pride, or one fear. The discipline is to notice the difference before the silence hardens into identity. So the art of being alone is not permanent escape from the crowd. It is the capacity to step out of noise long enough for thought to become legible, then step back into life without pretending the room has made you complete. The quiet is useful only when it leaves you less performative and more answerable. It should give you something real to bring back: steadier attention, cleaner love, more honest grief, a little less dependence on applause. That is where the intimate parts of life meet the practical ones. They all ask for room, but none of them can live on room alone. The empty room can show what belongs to you, though it cannot be the only place where you belong. If the room is quiet now, we should not pretend that the question has become simple. Being alone can become a way of escaping people. It can also become the condition in which you finally stop performing for them. The difference is not always obvious from the outside. Sometimes it is not even obvious from the inside, because the same closed door can hide fear in one life and freedom in another. But this is the art we have been circling all night. Pascal shows us why silence can feel unbearable, because diversion has been protecting us from ourselves. Montaigne shows us why retreat is not automatically wisdom, because we can carry the crowd into the room with us. Nietzsche shows us why distance can be necessary, and also why it can become dangerous when sharpness replaces sympathy. Arendt gives us the cleanest distinction. Solitude is not loneliness, and it is not isolation. Solitude is the condition in which we can keep company with ourselves. The question is not whether you should be alone more often. That would be too easy and probably too false. The better question is what happens to your attention when nobody is rewarding it in ordinary life. What happens to your thought when it does not have to impress anyone? What happens to yourself when the witnesses leave and something in you keeps arriving anyway? We should be honest about the limit. Solitude will not rescue us from the shared world. It will not replace friendship, love, repair, work, politics, or forgiveness. A life that cannot return to others is not deep because it is private. It is only cut off. And if we use solitude to avoid every claim another person has on us, then the room has stopped being a place of thought and has become a hiding place. And yet, a life that never enters solitude becomes thin in another way. It learns to live by reflection from every available surface. It waits to be confirmed before it knows what it thinks. It becomes loud enough to avoid hearing itself. We may still function that way. We may still be admired that way, but something quieter in us remains unconsulted. Maybe the art of being alone is not the art of disappearing. Maybe it is the art of returning with something less borrowed in your hands. Not a final answer, not a purified self, just a quieter relation to your own attention, and a more honest way of meeting the world again. You may find that the room does not give you a new identity. It gives you a pause before identity hardens too quickly. In that pause, we can notice which desires are ours, which fears are borrowed, and which voices have been living in us without being questioned. Then we can step back out, not above other people, but less dependent on their immediate applause. That is why the question stays open. The room is not a cure, it is a test. And when we enter it carefully, we may discover that being alone was never the opposite of belonging. It was one of the ways we learned how to belong without vanishing. So the door opens again, not as a defeat of solitude, but as its proof. If the quiet has done its work, we leave with attention steadier than before, and with less need to borrow our whole self from the nearest voice. The shared world is still waiting, but we meet it less scattered.